Hello friends and vacuum line lovers, welcome back to another episode of Curious and Clean. This series is inspired by my love of watching cleaning videos here on YouTube, but it always frustrates me that they're supposed to inspire you to clean, but the moment you look away, there's nothing to listen to but music. We're going to be cleaning, but we're also going to be learning something new together. Each video, I'm going to tackle a topic that I find interesting. This could be anything from mysteries to rabbit holes that I fall down on the internet. Today, I'm bringing you the story of the most kissed girl in the world. Let's get curious and clean. Today, we're going to talk about the most kissed girl in the world. This is the story of how a girl's death mask from the 1800s became the face of CPR dolls today. But before we dive into that, I wanted to provide some background on CPR. This will not only give our story more context, but there's a really interesting history here to uncover. CPR, or cardiovascular pulmonary resuscitation, has had a very rich evolution. From about 1530 to the 1800s, the bellows method was used. It was first used by a Swiss physician. And when I see this picture of the bellows method, it reminds me of that scene in The Princess Bride. I love that movie. It's so funny. By 1732 in Scotland, a local surgeon used mouth-to-mouth breaths to revive a suffocating coal pit miner. He documented the incident 12 years later in the first clinical description of resuscitation in medical literature. In the 1800s, physicians throughout the world were now experimenting with forms of artificial respiration. A Danish veterinarian discovered that he could restore a heartbeat to a lifeless chicken by shocking it to the chest. Meanwhile, in London, the Hall and Sylvester methods were commonly used in the early 20th century. The Hall method involved alternately repositioning the patient from face up to their side and adding pressure to their thorax. The Sylvester method created a chest pressure arm lift method, where you raise the patient's arms up to expand the chest and then cross the arms down over the chest to expel. In Germany, physiologists were discovering that massaging the heart externally with compression could help provide adequate circulation in animals. It wasn't long before this life-saving discovery began to be used on humans in hospitals. In those early days, though, CPR was called closed chest massage to differentiate it from the version with the chest cut open, in which the doctor literally reached in and squeezed the exposed heart. In 1956 and 57, Dr. Elam and Dr. Peter Safar proved that mouth resuscitation is an effective life-saving method, and for the first time in human medicine, an external defibrillator successfully restored a steady rhythm to a heart. The United States military adopted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation method to revive unresponsive victims. This takes us right up to the story that we're exploring today. In 1960, doctors Couvenhoven, Safar, and Jude combined mouth-to-mouth breathing with chest compressions, and they create cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or what we commonly refer to as CPR, and it was official. Within just a few years, the medical establishment had figured out that immediate CPR was the best hope for cardiac arrest survival and simple enough for anyone to learn. Now that CPR was beginning to catch on, the doctors needed a way to teach other physicians how to do closed chest cardiac resuscitation, which was the forerunner to CPR training we know today, which is available to the general public. In order to do that, they needed a special tool, a dummy that would allow people to practice CPR compressing its chest and breathing air into its plastic mouth. It's easy to take for granted CPR dummies today. After all, they are just lifeless objects. They don't exactly stand out as an interesting topic with a backstory. So it may surprise you to know that the CPR dummy, commonly called Resusci Anne, has a history of her own. And it isn't just based on any face. It was modeled after a girl's death mask that's over 100 years old. If you've never heard the term death mask before, let me explain. Human civilization has a long history of making death masks. These are likenesses typically made out of wax or plaster of a person's face after their death. They're commonly made by taking a cast or impression from the corpse. And while this may initially sound like a morbid idea, death masks were regarded as mementos of the dead, and they could also be used to create portraits. In some cultures, a death mask could also be a funeral mask laid on the corpse's face and buried with them. Some of the most common ones that you would recognize are the ones from ancient Egypt, created as part of the mummification process, like Tutankhamun's mask. But King Tut's death mask may not be the most famous. The death mask that inspired Resusci Anne has to be pretty high up there on the list. Her story began more than a century ago when the dead body of a girl believed to be about 16 was pulled from the River Seine. Some people speculate that she intentionally drowned herself because her body showed no signs of violence. At the time, the body was put on display in a public mortuary in hopes that someone would be able to identify her. This was a common practice during the time, but no one was ever able to identify the teenage girl. Instead of calling her the French equivalent of Jane Doe, they opted for a much more romantic La Connue de la Seine. Forgive me, I do not speak French, but I tried. This translates to the unknown woman of La Seine. People have long speculated about her background and life, and Albert Camus even likened her to Mona Lisa, and she is sometimes called the Mona Lisa of La Seine. The pathologist who did her autopsy was so impressed by her beautiful, serene facial expression that he asked a model maker to create a plaster death mask of her. It ended up being very popular, being replicated and sold many, many times over, and it is still sold today under the title Noyée de la Seine, or the Drowned Woman of the Seine. In the late 1950s, medical students were beginning to learn CPR, and Archer Gordon, a member of the American Heart Association's CPR committee, realized that a CPR dummy would be invaluable in helping students practice CPR without the risk of breaking their ribs as they practice on one another. To make it happen, he sought the help of a Norwegian toy maker, Asmund Lerdahl. As it turns out, Lerdahl had recently seen a reproduction of La Connue de la Seine on the wall of a relative's house, and he decided to give the CPR mannequin the same face. The serene Mona Lisa smile expression seemed to be hard to forget, and he was bewitched, put under her spell. In 1960, he began manufacturing the first CPR mannequins, and they coined the term Resusci Anne, or Resusci Anne. Where did the name Anne come from? Well, before making this mannequin, Lerdahl had also made a doll called Anne, so perhaps the name was just fresh in his mind. Resusci Anne was made of soft plastic with a collapsible chest for students to practice chest compressions. The lips were open for students to practice mouth-to-mouth. Today, over 300 million people worldwide have been trained in CPR, the majority of them using Resusci Anne, hence the moniker the most kissed girl in the world. So romantic. CPR is all around us and familiar in numerous pop culture references like this one, my favorite from The Office. Iconic. And also Michael Jackson's song Smooth Criminal. You know the line, Annie, are you okay? It was inspired by his own CPR training, and it's a line also used by trainees when checking for response. That's the story of Resusci Anne, the most kissed girl in the world, an anonymous victim of a drowning, never identified, but rendered forever memorable, surviving a century and helping to save countless lives, all because of her striking expression of serenity. So have you ever heard this story? I thought it was really interesting and something that I'd never learned about, but it also got me thinking about the ethics of making reproductions of a person's face and selling them without their consent. Certainly ethics 100 years ago were very different. Death masks were common in the culture, so nobody bat an eye. Today will be a lot more questionable, and perhaps that's why many CPR dolls of today look more general and anonymous. It reminds me a bit of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. If you haven't read that book or seen the movie, you absolutely should. It's an amazing story and an interesting read. It grapples a lot more deeply with these ethics questions behind using a deceased person's body, and in this case, cells without consent. But that's another story for another day. Thank you all for watching. I'd love to hear what you thought about the story in the comments below. Please like the video if you enjoyed it and share if you feel it's worth sharing. I have a lot of great episodes in the queue and I can't wait to share more with you. See you next time on It Came From a Vlog. Bye bye.